Greetings, this is Jared Love, and in this video I'm going to be going over dependent shapes and how they can be used for a control curve. So what I mean by dependent shape, it really just means it's a curve that is essentially deformed by other transforms. So the control points of the curve are dependent on some other transform. So the first example I really have for this is, say you have an IK with some pole vectors, and so easy. So for this control shape, I want to be able to select it anywhere and be able to select my actual pole vector control. So there could be a situation where, say, I don't know, your character is in a cramped space, like in a vehicle or something, and you've got the pole vector penetrating through some other geometry, and so you want to be able to select it easily so that you can manipulate it, but you can't necessarily see exactly where it is. Now, this idea kind of sprang from some things I've seen before where, let me just, let's hide this shape real quick, and I'll show this. So it would be something like this, where I've seen somewhere where they've got a pole vector control, and to help know which pole vector control goes to which IK chain, they've drawn this line between them, turn it to template so that you can just kind of follow that line to find it. But if they're hidden like this, you can't select this to actually select your real pole vector, whereas with the line going all the way to the joint, you can. So I've got two different ways of setting this up in this example. So one of them, this being the left side here, is using a dummy curve system. So I have the dummy curve, which is that templated curve that I was showing you here. And you would parent this somewhere where it's going to stay in world space. And right now it's being driven by these locators. They're pumping directly into the control points 0 and 1 XYZ values. And the locators themselves are here. So I've got one there and I've got one here. And these are just the shape nodes of the locator. These are not the transform. So if you're unfamiliar with the whole transform and shape functionality within Maya, if you look at any given locator, like if you just went to create locator, it creates a transform node with a shape node underneath it. So we're really just interested in the shape node because I don't need another transform cluttering it up. So I've got this locator, and I'm using that world position value from the locator. Now I could have also just used clusters, or you could even use a skin cluster. You can do whatever you need to deform this dummy curve to get it so that the control points are stuck here and here with your joint and with your pole vector. Basically, this is where that templated dummy curve stops. So what I've got going on here now is I also have a shape node, and it's just a 2-point curve, and it's parented underneath the transform. So I have this tetrahedron shape and I've got this line shape. And the locators are driving the dummy curve, which then, using a blend shape from the curve shape to what I'm calling the pointer curve, that 2-point line. So it's going between the shapes, not between the transforms, and that's important. So you want to make sure that when you create this blend shape, you are actually creating the blend shape between these two nodes and not these two nodes. Okay. So the other thing about this is this blend shape is its origin set to world. So you pretty much have two. There's local and world. So if we set it to local, you see that this curve shoots off. And that's because if we look at this dummy curve, you see that its position is at the origin. And so from the origin to these 2 points, it's offset this much. And so then when you create the blend shape, if it's in local space, if it's in local space, then this curve its 0 position is right here at the pivot point of your pole vector. So it basically is telling it go this distance for this point. So this distance and this distance is the same, and then same kind of a thing for here. So from this distance to here, that's the same as from this point to this point. So this curve, because you're parenting it underneath that transform, it's in this transform's local space, and your dummy curve is not. It's in world space. So you want to put that to world to make sure that this guy is, you're basically just overriding the local space. So it doesn't actually pay any attention to the local space of this transform anymore. Okay, so now that I've successfully beat that dead horse. So that's one method. And the other method that I've got going on for this other side here, I don't have the dummy curve, and I'm just using some various matrix nodes to essentially what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a point constraint for this control point of the curve so that it's always going to be constrained to this joint. So how you do that is we take this mult matrix node and you pump in the joint in this case, which is joint 5, which would be like your knee joint. I normally would name it, but anyway. And you take the world matrix and you plug that into the matrix in 0. And then the pole vector control, I'm taking the world inverse matrix and I pump that into the matrix in 1. So what that does is it takes the matrix data of this joint and puts it into the local space of this matrix's data. So once I have that, then the decomposed matrix is being used to just get those translate values, and I am pumping that into the control point 1 XYZ values, which for this curve, it is the 0 point is here and the 1 point is there. So that makes it so that wherever you move this transform, this point knows what values it needs to go to from this local space to get to that point, as if it was point constrained. Now you can see there's a lot of extra overhead with the dummy curve method. First of all, you've got an extra transform and curve shape. Then you've got this blend shape node, and it creates a blend shape set, it creates a tweak set, a tweak node, and aside from that, it's also, you are driving both of the points of this dummy curve to then drive both of the points of your the curve that you actually care about, which is a bit of overkill, especially from a deformation standpoint, because this point, the 0 in this case, is already in the right position because it's parented underneath the transform that it's manipulated by. So it's really just this one point here that you want to get back into a different position than what the transform has. So you've also got these locators here that, it's a bunch of extra crap, and if you look here, it kind of fills up the hierarchy, like these nodes, this node, all that stuff, whereas this is much cleaner because you just have and even this I could have cleaned up a little further. This could have all just been one shape. It would just require creating that same tetrahedron shape and having another control point right there that you can then drive with this position. So I didn't even need to do 2 shapes here. So you can see, even just by looking at the 2 different things here, much cleaner, kind of messy. They both get the same result, so depending on what you need or whatever, but personally I'd go with the matrix method because it's a lot cooler. And I think it's less computationally heavy because of all the lack of deformers and stuff in it. Okay, so another example I've got is, let's say this was like a brow control, and I know it doesn't really look like it, but so you've got basically along this character's brow, you've got these joints that are driven by these controls, and then these controls are driven by like a brow all control. So let's just close these up and take a look at that. So I've got a couple of different examples. So in this example, the brow awl kind of gets left behind when you move, your controls out. So you've got this nice pretty box that you've created, and then these individual controls, when you pull them out, they're outside of that box, and it could lead to a spot where you don't know where the controls are, or aside from the geometry being mangled, you could have them in a different order and be a little bit more difficult to unravel them or see what goes where, theoretically anyway. So I've got a few examples here. So I've got this one where now I've got this brow. It's the same transform, obviously. It's the brow awl control, but in this case I've made the shape dependent. So I've got this line that goes through each of my individual brow shaper controls. So you can see it changes the shape of my brow awl. So it makes it to where it follows the actual controls here. And you'll notice I've got this, they're kind of offset. So if I was to grab this and even if I rotate this, you can see that it manipulates the shape. It's kind of keeping this point as if it was parent constrained to that joint. And the reason I put that offset in is because if you didn't, these joints are right on top of the geometry. So this curve right here, the brow awl curve, would be coincident with the geometry, which would be a nightmare for trying to select it. So you would want to be able to pull it off of the surface of your geometry. Now there's one minor caveat with something like this. It really, what you want to do is you want to use it kind of the brow awl as like initial positioning and gross movement, and then use your individual ones more for shaping the actual geometry. And the reason for that is this transform doesn't actually move when you change the shape. So in this case, I've got the brow awl control, and then these individual controls are all just parented underneath it. They could be parent constrained or however you need to drive them based on your brow awl control. But by having your shape be dependent on the controls underneath it, you could run into a situation where, like say you grab all of these guys and move them all up. And so if you look at this, it looks like, okay, my brow awl control is right there with them. But when you select it, it's actually down here. So if you were utilizing the rotation, it would be rotating from this pivot instead of the pivot inside there. So you want it to be, I think it's probably around there, yeah. So this is going to be easier to modify than when the pivot is like way down here. So it's a minor caveat with that, but I think it does make it easier to select your brow awl control. And really, if you're just using it for translation, it's not going to be an issue. So let me zero these back out. And the way to do this, if you wanted to, you could do the dummy method where you can essentially do anything to that dummy curve that you need to, similar to this guy. You can use clusters, you can use a skin cluster to where you actually bind this curve to all of these joints, and then you've got that dummy curve, you put it into the world space, and then you use that world space blend shape again to make this curve then follow along. Or you can, use matrix nodes. And so to show you how that's being done, so these are all essentially the same setup. So you've got all the different brow controls, and then they are pumping eventually into the control points of the curve, so the XYZ. And so the way this is working is basically it's almost identical to this guy, the right pole vector example, which was the pink one, where you have your brow all control, and what you're wanting to do is you've got an individual control that you want to put the matrix data of that control into the local space of your all control. So you do it the same way. You take that world matrix, you pump it into the matrix in 0, and then you take the brow all control and you pump that world inverse matrix into the matrix in 1. And that gives you this matrix in this local space. So again, that's like a point constraint, or actually more like a parent constraint. Then to get the offset, instead of doing a decomposed matrix, I'm using this point matrix mult, in which I have the matrix sum pumping in as the in matrix, and then there's an in point on the point matrix mult, and I've got it to 0.2 in z. So I could change this value, to be a little further if I wanted, and it would, you see it moves the point out. So you can pretty much put it wherever you want. And then, of course, again, that's going directly into the control points. So I've got another example of you could take it a step further. Rather than having a line, you could do a more complicated shape. So in this case, I've got this, which, it doesn't necessarily look like much now, but it basically would be like if you were going to mimic the shape of your actual eyebrow hair, you could do that, to where you've got this curve that's outside of the eyebrow hair, or just in front of it or whatever, and then you can using this, it would essentially kind of shape that eyebrow hair, so you kind of get that arc into it. It doesn't look like much in a straight line, but so you can see here, if I take this guy and I rotate it, you see the points there on this curve. They basically look as if they are parent constrained to that individual control. So just to kind of show the connections for this. So there's a lot more nodes. Because of how I'm doing this, you don't need to do a separate mult matrix setup for every single one of them. For every single control point, because there's going to be a lot of control points. Because you really only need to do that once. You're getting the matrix data of this one and putting it into the local space of this. So you really only need to do that once for all of the points that are over here on this. And in this case, it's actually 5 points, because this was the starting point. There's the 0 and then the last index and then 1, and these are the last 2 before the last one. So you can conserve nodes by really just needing the point matrix mult for any coincident points. So in this case, most of them are not coincident with another. It's just that first and last point that are coincident. So you can see how this is pumping into that first and last control point, there and there. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I've got all of these different matrix mults, and they each have different in-point values to get those different positions. So if you wanted to do it more quickly, you could probably parent a little transform, or make it look like a locator, or you could even use a locator, and then just plug in the transform values into the in-point values here, and then you could then more easily and freely shape the control curve by just moving those locators around. And then once you need them, you should be able to delete them, and it would retain the information there. So That's pretty much it. So I hope you can find that useful, and please feel free to leave any comments or questions, and have a blessed day.